So welcome, everyone. Hope you've had a good break, a good afternoon, and just a renewed welcome to Ryerson, especially the School of Journalism. We're sitting in one of the classrooms in which we teach. My name is Joyce Smith. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Journalism, and I'll be moderating this panel on perspectives on engagement. So here's what I think how we'll organize ourselves. We'll have 15 minutes for each presentation. We'll hold the questions, I think, till the end because often there's interesting sort of synchronicity between presentations. And I'll introduce our presenters in order as they come up. So the first presenter we have is Matthew Powers, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Washington. And his research interests include journalism studies, political communication, and comparative media. He's working on two projects. One is looking at humanitarian and human rights NGOs as information providers. The second project is a comparative analysis of metropolitan journalism in France and the United States. I think we're going to be hearing more about that today. He received his PhD in media, culture, and communication from New York University, and he teaches both graduate and undergraduate classes. The paper is co-authored by Sandra Vera Zambrano, who's not here, but who is a faculty member at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico. So I'm sure we'll hear more from Matthew, but please welcome Matthew Powers.
Thanks very much. I know this is a panel on audience engagement, and I promise you I do have a perspective on audience engagement, and it'll take a little bit to get into it, so I sort of just ask for your patience in terms of getting there. So the talk that I'm going to give, or the paper that I'm going to present, is part of a larger project that I'm conducting with Sandra Vera Zambrano, who is pictured top left. She can't be here, so I told her I would at least put her image up so that people can see. And it's important for both of us that it is collaborative. It's, as anybody who does collaborative research knows, there's probably not any word that we've written together that hasn't been argued over endlessly. And so what we're doing for this larger project is we're looking at the changing news ecologies of two cities. So we have Toulouse, France, pictured on the left, and Seattle, Washington, in the United States. So why them? Well, these are two cities that share a number of affinities. They're of similar size. They have comparable levels of education and technology use. They both build airplanes, so one is home to Airbus, the other is home to Boeing. And they're home to a number of technology firms, both of them are. News organizations in the two countries, or in the two cities, also face similar pressures. So economically, news organizations are searching for business models that can be profitable. Professionally, journalists are experimenting with new ways to try to reach their increasingly fragmented audiences. And socially, citizens are worried about where civically useful content might come from. And so the approach we have to this is comparative. We take these two cities because they're embedded in what scholars routinely identify as opposing media systems. So on the one hand, you have France's more government-subsidized, more opinion or literary-oriented press, in contrast to the American sort of highly commercialized objectivity model. And so in bringing the two together, the sort of conceit of the larger project is to ask how and in what ways media systems process shared challenges brought on by changing economics, technology, and culture. So I'm just going to deal with one slice, and this is the slice that will connect up with the theme of engagement. So the slice I'll deal with today examines journalists' use of social media. And so in both places, as I think is true throughout the United States and throughout France, and I'm sure that this probably holds both for North America and Western Europe more generally, research shows that journalists regularly use social media, so Twitter, Facebook. So this is already known. We know that they use it. The question we want to ask or to explore is to what extent social media uses vary as a result of the distinctive professional, political, and economic environments in which they are used. And I think this is important at least for two reasons, and I'll sort of mention those two reasons. The first is simply that social media can obviously be used for any number of different uses, and these have different potential civic implications. So in other words, if journalists use social media simply to follow established sources, they're more likely than not to simply recreate existing ways of working rather than to transform it. And the second reason that I think it's important is that cross-national comparison can help try to see the systemic features that shape technology use. So in other words, how it is that commercial factors or political factors or professional factors shape the different types of uses that journalists make of these social media. So we sort of begin from the observation that existing scholarship provides opposing answers to this question of how it is that journalists' use of social media may vary cross-nationally. And on the one side, to the left, you basically have the supposition of convergence. And on this view, digital technologies are assumed to be used in largely similar ways. And they're assumed to be used in largely similar ways for two reasons. One, you have similar technological affordances, so the technology, the way it can be used, doesn't vary cross-nationally. And that's tied up with similar transformations in journalistic work. And so on this view, social media really provide a way for time and cash-strapped journalists to monitor information, to potentially interact with audiences, and to boost their personal and organizational profiles. And if you need a sort of name to pin to this side of the debate, I think probably the person who's done the most in arguing for cross-national technological convergence would be someone like Pablo Byczkowski at Northwestern University. Another side effectively argues for divergence. And so on this view, technology use is assumed to vary due to these distinctive political, economic, and professional environments in which journalists work. There's a stream of research that's come out along this, and while the precise patterns of social media use are sort of underspecified, scholarship in this domain suggests that it will vary. So that you should expect some variance. The question is how and in what ways. So what do we do? So to try and adjudicate this debate of convergence and divergence, we're going to draw on two different data sources. The first thing we'll draw on are 60 interviews with journalists in the two cities. So these are journalists working across different media formats, so print newspapers, television, radio, online-only news sites, and they include, strategically, they include both new and established journalists. So we're not simply talking to the 30-year-old person who's trying to be the mover and shaker within a legacy news organization, but we're talking to both him or her, but also to this 62-year-old person who is also using social media, but oftentimes in quite different ways. During these interviews, we tried to learn, amongst other things, how journalists are actually using these social media tools. These were open-ended and in-depth, often lasting between 1 and 2 hours per person. So if there's interest, I can talk more about how we did that and then how we did it cross-nationally in the Q&A. And then we complement it with, I sort of put regional and national news. What we do is we complement this with data about the economic conditions and the political environments in which journalists are operating. And so I'll say a little bit more about that, but that's really about the market position of news organizations, labor policies that protect journalists to some degree in the different countries. And this is really to try and show how these contexts shape the way in which they use social media. So what do we find? Actually, and this is sort of the sort of big level takeaway, and then I'll try and do a little bit of each side. Actually, our findings reveal a sort of complex mixture of convergence and divergence in social media use. So it's not simply that everything is converging or that everything is diverging. It's, in fact, that there's a little bit of both going on in interesting ways. So I'm going to try and explain each one in turn. So convergence first. In both places, so in both Seattle and Toulouse, journalists use social media to more easily accomplish practical tasks. Now, this might seem obvious, except for the fact that we often imagine that journalists will do things that are impractical, that in other words are not part of their daily routines. And so the things that they talk about most regularly are, well, we use it to gather information, to monitor sources, and to identify potential story ideas. And so the quotes that you see here exemplify this convergence, right? So these similarities in use. So on the left-hand side, you have an American journalist describing using Twitter to follow government agencies and therefore to provide information more quickly. And on the right-hand side, you have a print journalist in Toulouse. It's actually an editor at a newspaper describing how he tells his reporters to use social media as a way to get in contact with government officials. So I'm even telling freelancers, if you don't have a politician's number, look at his Facebook account and send him a message. Okay? Now, these quotes are representative in that we heard this from almost everyone using social media. And what's important about these shared uses is that they converge on the practical tasks that journalists have performed for decades. So it's the sort of basic things that they've always done. And that's where there's actually convergence. Now, what's important about this part is that in both cities, journalists also recognize the opportunity for alternative uses. And of course, there are some people who use them. But for the most part, they tend to refrain from them. And the reason is that they see such uses as impractical. That is, they're separate from their regular routines and practices. And so to give you an example of that, at several television stations, both in France and the United States, journalists told us about management initiatives to try and get them to post a certain number of social media posts per day. All right? Sometimes it was 5, sometimes it was 3, sometimes it was 7. These initiatives were regularly ignored. So they said, yes, we have to do it, and no, we never do it. And the reason I think it's actually a compelling reason, as one reporter put it, the only real deadlines we have are television deadlines, right? And so it's really the practical routines that they know that they have to fulfill. And so journalists converge in terms of those practical routines, and they mostly ignore social media uses that are not linked to them. At the same time, there are differences, and this is the part I think that's probably more interesting and links up with the idea of engagement. So in basic terms, the big difference is that in Seattle, journalists are more likely than their French counterparts to interact with audiences. Of course, this is a general tendency, not a hard rule. So of course, there are some people in Seattle who don't interact much with audiences, and there are, of course, some people in France who do. But the sort of general point is that in Seattle, journalists are on average, more likely to use social media to interact with audiences. And this can take many forms. So some describe their own success in terms of based on the number of likes a story receives. Others talk about using social media to help stories sort of find their best audiences, as one person put it. And still others talk about using social media just to see what people are talking about. So one reporter said, well, when I take the train to work every morning, I simply just sort of go through Facebook and I go through Twitter just to see what people have going on. And the difference there is that by contrast, individual French journalists tend to orient their social media use almost exclusively to peers. So they talk about cultivating audiences as their organization's problems, right? So they'll say, it's really not my problem, it's the organization's issue. And many also actively described using tools like TweetDeck to actually filter out audiences, right? So they say, I use TweetDeck because really I just want to know what journalists and what government officials are talking about. One person described it as filtering out the noise. So how do you explain this? Well, the argument that we're giving, and I'd be curious if people buy it and, so I'd be curious if you buy it, is that in addition to fulfilling practical tasks, journalists in both countries use social media to garner peer recognition. That is, they use social media to sort of prove that they're good journalists. But how they do this varies. And how they do it varies according to the distinctive environments, the distinctive professional environments in which they operate. And here's where the sort of structural aspect of the two places really matters. So in the United States, there's really heavy reliance on commercial funding. And so advertising as a percentage of revenue for the main newspaper in Seattle is about 90%. So 90% of its revenue comes from advertising. And there's also limited labor protections. And what this does is this incentivizes individual journalists to orient their social media use towards audiences. Now, what's important about this is that Seattle has, over the past decade, actually seen its workforce cut by more than half. And so just in terms of daily print newspapers, it went from about 540 journalists working at daily print newspapers in 2005 to about 170. Okay? Now, this is a huge, huge drop-off. There's partly contextual factors that has to do with one daily newspaper shifting to online and mostly cutting its entire staff. But the issue here is that it's an individual problem for journalists, and they have to actually be on social media because they see it as a way to demonstrate not only to peers, but also to their bosses that they're actually doing something to try and help. In other words, audiences mean money, right? Even though that's not actually true, even though if you have a big social media following, it won't necessarily bring you money, that's the perception. And in France, the difference is that news organizations are simultaneously less directly exposed to economic pressure. Not that there aren't any economic pressures, but they're less directly exposed, so advertising as a percentage of revenue is much lower. And individual journalists are actually fairly well insulated. Basically, it costs a lot of money, and I can talk about the labor regulations involved, but it costs a lot of money to fire a journalist in France, and it costs even more money the older they get. So this means that journalists can be relatively secure. They don't have to bring audiences, and so they're sort of working with one another to try and, to use their social media tools. So wrapping up, what are the takeaways? The first thing is that social media use converges, but it converges around pre-existing practices in both places. In other words, the affordances of social media that are most likely to be used are those that sync up with pre-existing routines. The ones most likely to be neglected are those that challenge those routines. The second piece, and the sort of second line, social media use, social media are also used to garner peer recognition. And how journalists do this varies according to national contexts. And I think this is important with respect to the American case, audience engagement is as much a symptom of commercial exposure and weak labor protections as it is a desire on journalists' behalf to interact with citizens. And the third thing is simply that social media use is in fact shaped by distinctive national contexts, even as we see some shared cross-national features. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I didn't get to use my finish or else sign. That's always a good sign. The next speaker is going to be Dan Rowe, who is professor and program coordinator of the Bachelor of Journalism program, the School of Media Studies and Information Technology at Humber College. Somewhere on here, I'm guessing there's an on button. It's already on? It is on. Okay, all right. Sorry, I had requests. She was meddling. Never been known to do it before, but there you go. So Dan is going to be speaking about voter turnout in Oshawa, both before and after the closure of the local paper. And Dan, while I'm doing this, I can also say about Dan.
That's enough.
That's enough?
Yeah, no, I'm good. That's fine.
He went to Western and did the master's program, just like I did, in journalism. I can say that. And he has his PhD from Syracuse University, where his dissertation was on comparing newspaper coverage of climate change during election campaigns in the US, Canada, and Australia. So, take it away, Dan.
Thanks. Thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. So, when the Guelph Mercury, which we heard a lot about this morning, and then the Nanaimo Daily News closed back in January, both in January of 2016, there was a lot of sort of public discussion and public concern about that. And for me personally, it raised sort of a lot of memories of the closing of what was sort of the only local daily newspaper in the area that I grew up, which was just outside of Oshawa. See if this works. Let's sort of read that. Now, the Oshawa Times was a daily newspaper, closed in November of 1994. I was 16 then, and living in, like I said, nearby. And my main connection at that moment was that I wanted to go there for like one of those high school co-op positions. It's one of the newspaper closures that didn't really inspire a lot of sort of public reaction or even sort of policy reaction at the time. No conferences like this. We have the oft-cited Kent Commission, which came about with the closure of the Ottawa Journal and the Winnipeg Tribune in 1980. It's also a newspaper that didn't inspire a ton of love, even locally. There were sort of mixed feelings about it. It was an evening newspaper, which even in 1994 was pretty antiquated, and a particularly antiquated approach. and it was owned by the Thompson family, the richest family in the country then as now, I believe. And they closed it basically in the midst of a labor dispute. So there also hasn't been a lot of research about the Oshawa Times, but one of the few pieces it was just recently published in Journalism Studies by Errol Solomon. I don't know if he's, oh, there you go, imagine that. We'll talk after. About sort of the formation of the union. And Oshawa, obviously, to give you, again, a little bit of context, was a very strong sort of union town. Its main employer was and may still very well be, the General Motors plants. Which dominated the city. In the city of about 120,000, when the paper closed, 23,000 people worked in those factories. The paper had about a circulation of about 21,000 when it closed. Like I said, it closed in the middle of a labor dispute. And in a handful of the other stories, some of which I have here, and a couple more I'll just sort of flash up there, that came out at the time, some people said they basically subscribed out of habit. They interviewed, the Star interviewed, as that story on the front page there goes on, and they talk to some local citizens and they say, "Are you sad?" And they're like, "Well, I subscribe because it seemed like the thing to do. I'll just get the Star now." And certainly the Toronto Sun had a huge circulation within, especially within the plants themselves. And then there were letters to the editor in both the Star and the Globe. Now the Globe, again, also owned by the Thompson family at the time, and still. They had letters to the editor basically saying, like, again, there were a lot of problems with the newspaper. It didn't, in some cases, it didn't represent the views of the factory workers. It was very pro General Motors and pro the company and pro business practices. So there was a lot of sort of mixed feelings about the closing of this particular newspaper. So, and there's also not a lot of trace of it sort of online. It came about, it never had a website. It closed in 1994, it never had a website. And in the stories that were published about its closing by some of the media critics at the time, Chris Cobb at the Ottawa Citizen and Antonia Zerbezius at the Star, none mentioned the onset of digital disruption as a reason for the newspaper closing. None, there was no discussion of that. It was other factors, largely just that it wasn't as profitable as it had once been for the Thompsons. And I was curious, again, these other closures raised some questions for me. It's like, what happened to the Times? What happened to the city after the fact? If we are, and this engagement in the city, political engagement, civic engagement. And so this is really, in a lot of ways, me trying to sort of see if I can sort of go back into the data sets that may be out there, talk to people who were around at the time, and it's the beginnings of a project to sort of see, did this have a great effect on the city of Oshawa, which was also going through large changes at the time, again, in the midst of layoffs at the plants. A growing chunk of the population in the city was very much less connected to the community, but working outside of, working and commuting to Toronto. So I wanted to see what happened, because if we have a sense that local news is important, here you have a case where a newspaper has disappeared, a daily newspaper disappeared, has not been replaced in 23 years. What do we know about political engagement since then? So I had a series of sort of guiding questions, research questions. Did the loss of the Times affect political engagement in Oshawa, civic engagement? And then one that's a little bit more sort of qualitative in nature. Did this have any effect on the community's understanding? Again, we assume or we believe that local news and news itself helps to sort of bind a community together. Again, we have a paper sort of stopped in its tracks. Did this change people's perception and understanding of this community that they lived, worked, and played in? For the most part, I'm going to just start looking at the first of these questions. And my first sort of thought with this was to look at voter turnout. Again, it's a very rough aggregate level data, or a piece of data, but it was sort of the first place to turn to sort of see if there was anything there even worth studying. I should note that I spoke with a professor, a colleague at Durham College, and who I knew had worked at the paper, and said, that I was interested in pursuing this, and his first question was, why? And then to give you a sense of the antipathy towards the paper in that community, he still lives and works there, and I sort of kept pushing him, and he finally indulged some of my questions and thoughts about it. So he's been a good sounding board, although most of our conversations have been over the phone, so I don't know if he's actually, paying attention. So what I looked at was voter turnout going back to the early 70s, when the paper was there, when the plants were thriving, and up until the present day. Again, this is very rough data. The gray line in this one is Oshawa. So you can see that it dips below not just the national and provincial average, but also some neighboring communities. One of the things I wanted to look at is, are communities comparable to Oshawa, places like Oakville, which we'd mentioned earlier, Guelph, St. Catharines, Brantford, Peterborough. I think I mentioned them all. Again, all within sort of the GTA, all have some similarities. And some differences too, which I'll get to in a bit. Was there any sort of differences that we can point out? As we can see, Oshawa, starting in sort of the mid '80s, had a real sort of drop off in voter turnout. And one other way that I sort of have tried to illustrate this was sort of using as a kind of this line here in the middle, the 0, is basically the national voter turnout number, and then sort of looking at how high above or below that did the various ridings. And again, for this analysis, I picked the specific riding that was most largely represented by, covered the largest chunk of the city. And again, you can see Oshawa rather, has like a low, is well below most of the rest of the average for the country. When it comes to, and it starts early. It starts before the newspaper closes. You can see the dip starts. The dip actually starts in the 1980s, and actually starts to happen in 1988. Which, if you know a little bit of it seems a little bit strange, given that was the big free trade election, an issue that you would have thought affected Oshawa a lot. Now again, there are a whole bunch of factors here potentially at play. It was also a very safe NDP riding at that time, represented by the leader, Ed Broadbent, so there may have been a sense that was not necessarily, turning out the vote was not hugely important then, but you see that dip continued through the 80s, the 90s, and into the 2000s, starts to turn around. I also look provincially, and you see a similar type of trend. Again, this is with the average. A couple of notes on this. In two of the elections, in two of the provincial elections in particular, Oshawa had the lowest voter turnout in the province during this particular period. So again, very low, by this very sort of crude political engagement measure, it seems like they're not especially engaged. And again, this is happening before the paper itself even closes. And I'll illustrate that with my second graph, if only because I made it. So I'll show you it. There you can see Oshawa, well below the average, and well below sort of well below a lot of the comparative, or the cities at least that I chose to sort of contrast it with. One thing I will note, one of the cities that's sort of been, I was at sort of the highest level frequently was Oakville. Oakville is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it does have, it has a Ford plant there, so it is engaged in the automotive industry as well. But as was noted in one of the presentations earlier, it's one of the richer cities. It's one of the richer cities in the province. And the other factor is it doesn't have a daily newspaper. It has a thrice weekly, three times a week paper. So, at this point, for me, it's starting to raise some questions, I think, around the relationship between local news and at least political engagement, or encouraging me to sort of look at this a little bit more closely. I tried to gather municipal election data for this. For these, I was able to find Oshawa's and some of the other cities, but it's incredibly difficult to find people who even know where to find it in some of these cities, going back beyond the first couple of years. So it wasn't as useful as I thought it might be, although it struck me as notable that there wasn't a huge dip. Municipal elections, you would think, would be most affected by local news, in that would be the only place you would get information on it. And if you look at 1994, that was the year when there was an election, and the year the newspaper closed, and after that there was no particular decline. nothing noticeable, at least, there. So, as I mentioned, these are very early steps, and this is incredibly sort of crude data, but made me intrigued in at least looking at this further. So, next steps for me, and I'm intrigued to hear from others if they have some thoughts on where to go with this. This suggests to me, at least, if I'm hypothesizing from this, which would be the next step, people do seem to be finding ways to gain information about Oshawa and its politics. Whether it's the weekly newspaper, whether it's short radio newscasts. Czech's television added a local television newscast in this period. Maybe it's social media, maybe it's Katz and Lazarsfeld's opinion leaders. But I think it lends itself to more, it leads itself to more studies. And one of the things I want to look at is, I've labeled it the Canadian Election Survey, but it's the Canadian Election Study data, which does have a huge amount of data going back many years and does ask questions about media consumption. So I've started to look at that, but I'm nowhere near in a position to present it in front of all of you. But I'd like to sort of tease some of that out. And it does have it by postal code level, so I can pull out some of these cities and start to look at that. And then, as well, census data to look at other factors that might be involved in this. I think clearly one of the things is, looking at the contrast between Oshawa and Oakville over an extended period of time suggests to me that education level may be a factor, is almost certainly going to be a factor. Income level is probably a factor, and probably a much stronger factor than, again, to hypothesize than the quality of local news. And that's sort of the final thing that I'm interested in looking at and considering is the quality of local news. It's come up a couple of times over in the presentations I've been at today, but I think we have to think seriously about, and again, it's been discussed, but are people getting the sorts of information that they need, or that they want, or that is even helpful from these local news outlets? And if not, then maybe what we're starting to see in the case of the Oshawa Times is that losing some of these older news outlets that maybe aren't producing the type of news that has a great deal of value is not as great a loss, with due respect to the people who may be losing their jobs. But sort of on a broader level, thinking about it, thinking of the larger picture, I think it's worth at least considering the possibility that these new models that a lot of the presenters have discussed today and will over the course of this presentation are the way that we should be looking, and some of these older models maybe haven't been serving the citizens for a long time. I'll stop.
Our next presenter is Philip Savage, who's going to be speaking on CBC Hamilton journalism, audience engagement, and changing digital content. And while I just get you set up here, Philip has a PhD from York University. He lectures and writes on the history of and changing roles of audiences in Canada and around the world. He teaches at McMaster University in the areas of communication research methodologies, media policy. He's had a long career in community media, public broadcasting, and professional media research. He's been involved in public policy formation with groups like the House of Commons, the CRTC, and we're delighted to hear what he has to say. By the way, for those of you who don't have a seat, there are some seats here if you want. I know it's not the most friendly setup to try and get a seat, but Philip, please. Thank you.
Okay, well, can you hear me? Everyone hear me? Okay. So I thought I'd start with something that's a little bit counterintuitive to the steel mill kind of impression of Hamilton that you have if you don't head down that way very often. When we were actually talking to people about the launch of the CBC station in Hamilton, we talked to everyday people, we talked to a lot of community leaders, and they said part of the issue around Hamilton's coverage was not just that there was relatively little CBC-style coverage within the community, it was the impression left of Hamilton out to the rest of the country. And one of the things that you may not know is that Hamilton has the largest number of waterfalls within the municipal area and beautiful, beautiful green spaces throughout the Hamilton Mountain and so on and so forth. And this is just a tweet that came up. And the other thing is that they were celebrating very recently the 5 years of CBC Hamilton. So I worked at the CBC doing audience research for many years, too many years. And I was there in 1992 when we had the first online radio for Quirks and Quarks. And the host at that time sat in a room with the technicians and got comments from Tokyo on the show as it was being live broadcast. This was amazing. And of course, what gripped media organizations at that time was how do we actually move beyond this moribund model of one-way communication to this interactive approach. I can name the CBC board members if you want, but we had this amazing opportunity, both as a pedagogical experiment, but also a research experiment for a number of graduate students and undergrads, to ask a series of questions about what would happen when CBC actually got its own station. And it was being proposed just before 2012, so 6 years ago, they really started talking about it. So we did a series of quite large surveys with the help of Léger, and also focus groups and in-depth interviews with community leaders. And we were asking about whether audio-video journalistic content is essentially still relevant in the digital multi-delivery environment. Because one of the reasons we were asking about this was that there wasn't very much money for regional expansion, but it was on the book. Hubert Lacroix wanted to really make his place. The previous president, Robert Rabinovich, had basically said, we're not wasting money on local expansion. It's far too expensive. Remember, his background was Seagram's. But it wasn't good bang for the bucks. So there was a lot of resistance to doing it. In a way, Hamilton was chosen as one of the places to expand to local coverage was because they weren't going to be able to do a radio station, they said, because there were no frequencies. That little corner of Lake Ontario has more FM stations available to it than probably anywhere else in the world, because they're getting it all from Buffalo and Toronto and everywhere in between. They were going to take the campus radio station frequency if they could, but oddly enough, the good people at the campus radio station and at McMaster said, no, we'd like to keep our frequency, thank you very much. We wanted to ask also, has local journalism changed from the audience point of view? In other words, if you went to just an online version of local coverage, how does that fit with audiences' expectations? And then what sort of new forms of audiovisual journalism exist in an interactive multimedia environment? And how do they best serve, reflect, and engage local audiences? So we've answered all those questions. That's all over. No, we haven't. We haven't begun to really scratch the surface on this, but it was a good test case to start. What's interesting is 10 years before Hubert Lacroix thought he could solve a kind of a political issue and also technological issue, an audience issue, there was a very interesting thing that was happening right here. In fact, that probably kind of involved in an indirect way some people from journalism school and RTA here at Ryerson. There was a redo with Andy Barry retiring from the Metro Morning on CBC Radio 1, 99.1 FM. And so you have a new host, and they did a rebuild. They under Susan Margetti, the leader, the head of the local CBC radio, there was a complete rebuild and rethinking, and I would say a culture change around what it meant to reflect the community of Toronto. And they started with these three preoccupations, not technological, which they should have, because that was even more in the heyday of really thinking about the influence of the actual media delivery. But they started with actually saying, we're going to, and the expression became, and you can hear it still on the CBC, they say, we sound like Toronto looks, okay? And so they concentrated on actually bringing new voices into the staffing of CBC. Ethnic and tonally, diversity, radio professionals, all levels, managers, full-time freelancers, to build the programming around format and innovative content strategy, specific to Toronto, relevant to Toronto's, and shared to all the communities. And then the audience, there was very much an audience orientation as part of that, with a really deep dive on all the aspects, the metrics of audience, the ratings, but also qualitative studies with different communities and community forums, panels, and feedback through the whole process. There was a remnant of that that was sort of in the air when 10 years later they started to look at Hamilton, and people thought, oh, right, well, let's do some of this. Nothing. A lot of publicity about the development of this, but almost no community participation in the process between the announcement and the bringing in. And in fact, one of the things that happened was that 2 of the 3 main reporters that actually started at CBC Hamilton came from Toronto. Now, any of you who know Hamilton, you can imagine how quickly that rumor went through the community. Okay, and I have to be careful because maybe they were actually from this program. I don't know. Okay. In a sense, what happened is they wanted to put Hamilton on the map, but on the cheap. They didn't do the work that had been done in Toronto, and partially because, I would argue, maybe there wasn't as much pressure. You cannot reinvent Toronto, which is a quarter of the CBC audience, and English-speaking audience, without a lot of consideration. They did go with the latest geotagging kind of approach, but the very first web page that opened, which was all there was going to be for CBC Hamilton, was that one right there, if it's showing. And it was like all geotagging, which nobody understood. And all that happened was that you would go to the geotagging, it would just open up a story. So what's happened since is that it's become a little bit more sort of a kind of a normal. So this is like what it looks like today. And quite frankly, the journalism is really good with the 3 journalists and the executive producer. It's really good. It's in-depth. It's thoughtful. But all it is a web page. All it is. That's all it is. Oddly enough, a lot of Hamiltonians are quite happy that at least they have that. And as you can see, it's integrated fully into sort of all of the other promotional things you would imagine, the Anne of Green Gables stuff and so on and so forth. Okay. So Hubert Lacroix, as it was just about to open, and they used this as part of the CBC renewal to demonstrate that CBC was reaching out to the various communities, said, we launched CBC Hamilton, a new digital service that provides a robust, up-to-date experience. What the hell does that mean? Anyone know what that means? It's not TV or radio. There are no available frequencies in Hamilton. Instead, we're using the web to its full potential to provide the up-to-date local information people in the community want. They did no research on that as to what the people wanted, because we were the only ones doing the research. They didn't really put the effort into staffing. They didn't really demonstrate that they were doing anything that was particularly innovative. And they certainly had demonstrated, they never shared. It was very unclear how much they actually ever did any audience research. So we did. So about a year after the launch, here's what the CBC Hamilton, I can't walk away from this thing, can I? Okay. So here's what the CBC Hamilton situation looked like about 6 months after the launch. So here's this funny little thing. Anyone worked for CHCH? It was a very strong local TV channel. Went through all sorts of weird things, including being owned primarily after it was sold to basically a company that made most of its money doing online porn. Channel Zero, do you remember this? And then 2 years ago, it was basically also downsized. They tried to fire most of their journalists, but every week, about 3/4 of people would actually use this service. The Hamilton Spectator, still fairly strong in Hamilton for a local paper. The Hamilton Community News, which is basically different versions of the Tourist Star, local weeklies. Almost half of people reading on a weekly basis. The spec.com having almost half of people checking into it at least once a week. CHCH.com, 25%. CHML, 900. Astral Radio Group, very strong in many areas. Cable 14, if anyone wants to talk about community media, look at Cable 14. They're actually quite independent, and they do some of the most amazing journalism on a cable station that you're ever going to see. View magazine, and there's CBC Hamilton, and it's, as far as we can tell, it still only has about just under 23, between a fifth and a quarter of people using it all in the course of a week. Okay. This is what CBC Hamilton CA looks like relative to the use of the other CBC properties, all of them coming out of Toronto in red. CBC TV, about 3/4 watch in the course of a week. CBC TV, of course, a lot of that is, well, it's all national or Toronto. CBC Radio 1, still more predominant than CBC Hamilton. CBC Toronto.ca just below, and then CBC Radio 2 at 16% of people checking in. But here's what's amazing, and here's the thing about the internet still for most properties, is that this is a breakdown of those between a quarter and a fifth of people who actually use CBC Hamilton, cbc.hamilton.ca. Here's how many people use it along the range of how they use radio, which would be over 10 hours a week. Most people who tune to CBC Radio 1 use it at least 10 hours a week. Okay? It's that vertical listening that often happens. That's the same percentage of that quarter of the population using CBC Hamilton. 80% are using it for under 3 hours a week. Okay? The Toronto rejig was based on telling the story of Toronto and its communities across the whole spectrum on an ongoing basis. That doesn't happen with CBC Hamilton.ca. What did it actually add to CBC's place in Hamilton? Without the CBC Hamilton, 75% of people were using some form of CBC at some point. With Hamilton.ca, CBC Hamilton.ca, 77. So in fact, they increased their reach by 2%. Does that make it unimportant? It just makes it less impactful, I would say. What people want when we did the qualitative work, both in the focus groups, interviews, and in the actual Leger survey, was we asked, what is important to you? 83% said local coverage is important. They think they're a bit more mixed on whether local media does a good job. They go for information a little bit more than entertainment. Relatively few people are saying that they get most of their information online, and very few people are saying still that they get most of their information social media. What they didn't get, are you telling me to stop at this point?
Yeah, you've got a minute.
Okay. It's not winning the hearts with online content. 31% of Hamiltonians say CBC excels in local news. They do not feel it's a strong voice, only 30%. Levels of satisfaction are low, not enough AV. CBC relies on user-generated news. One of the things that the CBC was asked to do was to actually provide an online morning show, right? Now, there are 25% of people in the survey who said they would actually be either very or somewhat interested in an online. In Kitchener-Waterloo, where they did a similar experiment, they managed to get the frequency and the level of commitment because of the narrative storytelling through the day is something that allows them to actually hear the voices of KW. Sometimes we do need to rethink our strategy of hoping the internet will just go away, or at least our version of the internet will just go away. And sometimes, actually, it's not a bad idea to keep a range of different distribution, including the narrative voice and sounds of radio. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Philip. I guess I'm introducing myself. Thank you. So my name is Joyce Smith. As I say, I'm an associate professor here at the school. I've been here since 2001. Before which I was at theglobemail.com, one of the first members of the online-only team. there. And before that, I worked briefly at the Toronto Star. I've got a PhD in religious studies from a South African university, and that's my main research interest, is looking at religion and how it gets covered. So this is a bit of a departure from my usual research, and so I too am looking forward to receiving some feedback on it. So what I'm interested in looking at today is the connection and the relationship, really, between local news and charities, charitable giving. So far, to be honest, there isn't a lot of research. It's one of those nice things where there's not a lot, which means you can carve out your own space, and there's not a lot, so you can't really rely on much. But most of the research looking into generosity and journalistic reporting talks about how natural disasters and relief efforts are covered, how do celebrities influence giving, and what effect do stories about fraud have on giving. So I'm interested in actually looking more at the relationship between news outlets and different forms of generosity. So that could be foundations created by news owners. It could be the alliance of outlets with religious and secular charities. And we know that public journalism has served both nations and neighborhoods as a generator of social networks. And I'm thinking about one of our panelists that we heard this morning talking about bonding, linking, and bridging. And I see this as a very good example of that kind of relationship. So what I'm interested in discovering is if news organizations as they've existed for centuries start to falter with this digital disruption and business model disruption, what does this mean for the generosity, both that they're active in with their own foundations, their own causes, but also that they influence as secondary stakeholders. So once upon a time, fundraising was front page news. Here's a front page from the Toronto Daily Star for December 23rd, 1949, all about Santa Claus and the Santa Claus toy drive, how much money needed to be raised. Is there a Santa Claus, using the New York example. And this was, as you go through the archives, you see a lot of this kind of major space and resources given to fundraising. This kind of thing we don't see today, for good or for bad. But it's complex. It's much more complex, and there has been some work done in the history of charities and newspapers in the New York scheme of things. So there were, for instance, in 1893, Joseph Pulitzer's World newspaper established what he called a free bread fund. And basically they had wagons that went through New York with big logos on them for the New York World, giving out bread. And their big thing was, we don't care about how you came to be poor, how you came to be hungry, take some bread and go with it. And with this, they kind of established public fundraising drives to supply the money needed for the bread. And they did this with accompanying, often very sentimental, sensational stories. Nellie Bly was among the reporters who did these, that would talk about examples of individual distress to try and kind of prod people into supporting their fundraising funds. And it wasn't long before competing newspapers also started up their own funds. So the New York Herald started a free clothing fund. The Tribune also started a fund, but they were the more conservative of the newspapers. And so interestingly, with their fund, they made a point of saying, but we're going to vet the people to whom we give charity. So they ran a lot of stories about, the fraudsters out there who were taking advantage of New York, coming to New York to get free bread and free coal and free whatever else. So they had this sort of double-edged thing of we're willing to give and we will give charity to people, but we're going to vet them. And so a lot of the stories were about how they went in, how they actually met people. They had stories about discovering closets full of beautiful gowns and deciding they weren't worthy recipients of the charity. And so they set themselves in direct opposition to these freewheeling Pulitzers and others who were just giving stuff away. So in 1893, Pulitzer had they were called Bread River bread giveaways. And it was very interesting because the coverage very much was tied to this idea of public policy about who is deserving, how should charity be devolved upon people. And there were, even at that time, social workers and people who were affiliated with often religious charities and foundations who were really concerned about what the newspapers were doing. By 1916, the Tribune editors basically said, we did this to up our circulation. It wasn't so much because we were altruistic, we just saw it as a way to engage in newspaper wars. And a lot of workers, social workers at the time, were really concerned about the added humiliation that was being put upon these people who required some kind of charity or support because of the way in which they were being described in the press. And as I say, there were all sorts of tricks being employed to try and get these people to tell their stories, and a certain amount of reticence from those who were actually on the receiving end. What was interesting, too, is that despite the hype for all of these things, less than 4% of funding during one major winter, 1893-94, came from the newspaper funds. So the charities that were already on the ground in New York were actually doing the majority of the charitable giving and the charitable work. What's not so clear, though, is how this kind of agenda setting pushed giving among other charitable organizations. So as with all sorts of other kinds of audience reception work, it's not always easy to draw a direct line from one to the other. These kinds of stories may well have spurred people. The other thing that I find interesting when looking at some of the ways in which journalists have related to charitable organizations comes from discussions around gender and charity. And one of the suggestions is that once upon a time, the sort of charity balls that would appear in the social pages and the news about charitable fundraising and events that was mainly dominated by women suggested a way that women, at least at this time, were not able to influence political life and city life, community life. Were finding alternative ways of doing it. And I think this still applies to a certain extent. This is a still from a documentary film about Hungarian-Canadian debutante balls. And there still are a lot of debutante balls, these kinds of galas, these kinds of events that are serving a community bonding thing, but they're also big fundraisers for certain charities. And you see this even from 1909 with fundraising for daycares that continue to exist. But it's a different kind of charity. Obviously, this is at the top end of the sort of socioeconomic fabric of, in this case, Toronto. But what interests me here is what happens as has happened now. I'm guessing for those of you who are in the GTA, if I said Zena Cherry, some of you might remember the society pages that existed that would report on this. But now we tend to see them in things like the Real Housewives of Toronto. That's the way in which some of these galas and events are shown. They don't show up so much in our newspapers or news outlets. I wanted to, for instance, give the example of fresh air funds. The Toronto Star here in Toronto is one of the major players in fresh air funds. But it actually started in 1877 in New York. And interestingly, again, it was with a pastor named Reverend Willard Parsons. He saw a lot of children in inner city New York who were suffering from a tuberculosis epidemic and thought, wouldn't it be great if we could take these kids out into the fresh air, out into the country during the summer and get them out of the hot city. And the Fresh Air Fund continues to operate in different ways. Toronto is another one. Very interestingly, I won't play the video, but you can take a look at YouTube. This is a YouTube ad for the Toronto Star version of the Fresh Air Fund. If you look at their FAQs, they have a great story about Joseph Atkinson strolling through a hot Toronto in 1901 and realizing that kids need to get out, and establishes a fund to take them all to cottages and cabins. It says nothing about the fact that this was being done in New York years before, and I have a pretty good feeling that Atkinson probably knew that this was being done. But the reporting of it does a lot of interesting things. There's an interesting construction of what is a good kind of upbringing for children, the rural-urban divide. And if you look at both the New York Times, for instance, and the Toronto Star, you continue to see these sort of relatively sentimental stories about the children who require some kind of help and how they're going to benefit. The other thing that was interesting looking at some of these old, you won't be able to see it, but this is a 1902 page from the Toronto Daily Star. If you look way down here, this is they used to actually publish right on the front page who the donors were and how much they were giving. So this really interesting thing about naming, and in some cases it's very much like there's a Dr. Fotheringham here, and then there are things like a friend or GF, God's friend, or employees are listed, and the dollar amounts, and so they would run these totals on the front page. So again, it's an interesting idea of both bonding and in some ways naming and almost, I guess, public shaming if your name doesn't show up there. Here's one from 1909 about sickly mothers and children and how after 2 weeks they seem to suddenly have healthy glows about them and how important it is. From my point of view, being interested in the reporting of religion, it's very interesting how there's often the inclusion of priests and ministers and other kind of religiously affiliated people who are actually running these organizations that are being supported by the Toronto Star. So in this case, we have Reverend Robert Hall, a city missionary who's talking about the healthy glow that the mums and babies have once they're taken out of the nasty city of Toronto. And even more recently, this is something I did not know about. This is from the Hamilton Spectator. We've just been hearing about Hamilton. From a story last year out of Grimsby, where children from the Bronx are spending a few weeks at a time in rural parts just outside of Hamilton, which is, for those of you not from the area, quite close by. And I couldn't help but note that there looked to be some old order Mennonite families who are also taking these kids from the Bronx. So there's this really interesting representation of charity and who needs charity, and even in this case, cross-border. This ran, actually, the online version runs with a full photo gallery. In terms of religion, I was also really struck at for how long, because I thought that this secular news and the way that they would be looking at charities would sort of represent a pivot from religiously based charities to secular ones. But I was struck, for instance, by this editorial in the Globe and Mail from 1949, the day after Christmas, talking about men of our faith. It's written from an absolutely Christian point of view with no worries about coming across, and talking about how we should this day share the joy of our family circle by making a contribution to the Hospital of Sick Children. So it's an editorial appearing in, certainly at that point, was the most important national and local newspaper to some extent, asking that little kids give some of their Christmas money for the creation of what is now the Hospital for Sick Kids. Even the Arab refugees out of Gaza in 1949 were moved by the reporting of the New York Times and were giving $1 or $2 via a Universalist church member to help the New Yorkers. So who gets what is a very big deal. There's been, as I say, there are kind of a dearth of studies, which in some ways is very exciting for me, but a study done published in 2004 by Josh Greenberg and David Walters looked at correlations between certain kinds of charity and how much press coverage they get. And to cut a long story short, what they found is the bigger the budget of the NGO or the nonprofit, the more stories they got. So it's not surprising, but it really points again to who actually gets their message across and potentially is able to do more fundraising. So these are the things that I'm going to be looking at as I go forward. One is, if we have the end of advertising for charity events in the same way that we've stopped having advertising for commercial interests and obituaries and all sorts of other things, there's still a need for publicity. And there's still a need for accountability at the local level. And how is that going to play out in the current scheme of things? What about the idea, which is clearly shown in the historical record, of using charitable drives in some ways for proving worthiness in a local community? If you're trying to make a case for continuing to be a local community source, it seems to me that showing that you are active and at least supporting, even in a media sponsorship way, local charities could be a really important thing. And finally, and this is the kicker, is what happens when journalism becomes the recipient of charity, right? And we're seeing more of that now, where foundations are underwriting certain forms of journalism. So this is something that I want to continue exploring, and I think could be kind of fun as well. Thank you. So in the time remaining, if I could invite my fellow panelists to come up and we can engage with the engagement panel and the audience. Hi.
I just have some information for Dan in response. Maybe I thought of that already. I used to be a union rep for local 87M, which is a local that called Thompson's bluff and found out it wasn't a bluff.
Right. Okay.
In the years that followed the closure of that paper, I was wondering about whether or not other newspapers took up the slack. So a couple of lines of inquiry, if you haven't already done it. So Toronto Sun, obviously,
Yep.
shipping papers, like 10,000 papers a day out of that plant.
Yep.
There's the contacts that can,
Okay.
the question is whether or not they have local Oshawa content. At one point in the early aughts, they actually thought of putting out a separate Sun in that area. But I'm switching contact with people who would know whether or not they actually boosted the Oshawa local content to
Okay.
fill the void.
That'd be great.
The Metroland paper,
Mm-hmm.
Oshawa Times. So when I serviced that, as the union rep serviced the staff there in the early aughts, they were up to four publications a week
Mm-hmm.
and a very high page count. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that was in a response to the void or not, because I was 10 years later.
Mm-hmm.
But I give you names for both of those.
Okay. No, I appreciate that.
You find out maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Close
Yeah, I know, thanks a lot for that, I appreciate it. I know that both the Star and the Sun responded in different ways. The Star had a section and a bureau out there. The Star's was launched with a lot of fanfare, and it was a separate section, and it didn't last very long. I think the reporters, a couple of them may have stayed working in that area. They might have already been living in that area. But then we're just sort of general assignment reporters. And I know the Sun, I think probably up until the present day, still sends. I know I worked summers in the in the plants, and on the midnight shift at about 4:30 in the morning, there would be a sudden flood of Toronto Suns for everyone to read. But I don't remember there being specific content. But I'll connect with you after. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
So this question is more for Philip, but others do feel free to answer. I'm interested in this idea. Do you feel like radio or podcasting is perhaps better suited to sharing local news than print media? Is that, like, do you see there be a case for that?
Radio, generally, it's hard for me to say that's the case. But within this sort of trajectory of the CBC's role in regional areas, there's certain areas where where TV has had a really big impact, in part because it's not just news, it's a whole range of things. So for instance, in Eastern Canada, especially in Halifax, St. John's, there's a tradition of variety going all the way back to Don Messer's Jubilee and all of those things, which seem goofy and kind of foolish, but actually was really important. And actually CHCH in Hamilton had similar things like that within the 50s and 60s that were really, I think it was
Tiny Talent Time.
Mm-hmm. Which were like incredibly important. And of course CHCH was the leading independent television station in Canada and innovated a whole bunch of things which we now would feel were kind of slightly corny, but they were very, very effective. My point is more kind of about the importance of a voice. A voice. And I mean, we did a lot of in-depth kind of analysis with people. And there may be a little bit of bias because there were people who had some familiarity with CBC radio, generally. So, but that story, like the ability to hear the stories and the voices and see on TV, insofar as it happened through the CHCH example or occasionally through CBC coverage, to sort of the storytelling. It's harder to do the story outside of a linear kind of, here we are, people talking, people showing you the home movies, in a kind of, as it exists traditionally with web pages, and as this, because CBC Hamilton did not do anything very revolutionary in terms of its web presence. So that level of connection we did not feel. We have not felt as a result of a kind of web page only kind of coverage.
Thank you. Yes, hi. Yeah.
This is also for Dan.
Yeah.
So thanks for also being interested in the Oshawa Oshawa Times.
Sure.
Another, it's more a comments, so maybe you can respond to it. So in addition to the bureaus that opened at the Toronto-based papers, the Oshawa Times Union itself launched the Oshawa Independent. So they did try to start their own labor-owned and controlled newspaper. And I mean, perhaps maybe you can speak more about it if you like. But so there was an attempt, a local attempt to continue on with the local-based, Oshawa-based worker paper, and I'll leave it there.
Yeah, my reading on that, and again, the professor at Durham that I spoke to about it, he worked on that for a while as the Independent, they called it, and they'd been publishing during the strike, I believe, before the paper was officially closed. The strike didn't last that long. It wasn't like the one in Halifax now. It was like a couple of weeks. But it didn't have the funding, it seems, to last. And at one point, some of the articles that I read about it said it was looking for funding from investors, like a group run by Larry Grossman, who was a conservative politician. Yeah, an odd sort of fit, you would think, but a conservative politician provincially at the time was seen as maybe the savior, but that never came through. There have been a few other papers since then that have sort of started and stopped, although the Metroland paper has been there consistently. Thanks.
Yes.
Yes, I found everyone's presentation fascinating, and Joyce, yours particularly so. My question, though, is for Matthew. In terms of social media, there's been quite a lot of good stuff that has fairly recently been covered by TVO in respect of content moderation on social media. And the social media companies, they don't really want to talk about that, apart from relatively recently Facebook. What can you tell us about that? Like, how does it affect what we actually see, and how much content moderation is going on?
Just to clarify, you mean within the news organizations or within these platforms?
Well, I like, who's doing the content moderation would be one question.
Yeah.
TVO seems to have an explanation. They have an expert that explains,
Yeah.
people generally work for like call center type organizations on behalf of, I guess, the social media company.
And you
Right.
know what TVO is?
Yes,
Okay.
but we don't. Yeah,
Okay.
so I can, in terms of speaking to the empirical data that I have, we have interviews with journalists in 2 cities, and so I can talk a little bit about social media management from the news organization perspective. I don't have anything about the platforms themselves and their relationship to individual journalists or individual news outlets in either of these cities, largely because they're not big enough media markets for them to really care about. So they're certainly on these social media sites, but they're not, they don't have direct relationships. In both cities, it's relatively common to have social media managers who are in fact tasked with making sure that the content appears on Facebook, on Twitter, that it finds the audiences that are relevant to it. There are a couple of social media managers in Seattle who are actually evaluated based on the amount of interaction and engagement that they can get. So their job actually depends on making sure that they boost the number of shares, the number of likes. For me, I think the interesting thing for news organizations is that, particularly in the US, like, the assumption is that those measures will then lead to money, even though they have no actual evidence that that's actually what's happening. So in other words, they're not actually bringing in more revenue because of this, right? But it is certainly something that motivates them on a day-to-day basis. So if you're a social media manager for, an online news site in Seattle, you spend a lot of your day thinking about how is it that I can get these stories to get picked up by others, right? And so there's a lot of attention that gets put to that. My guess is that your question is more about the platform providers. I just don't have any data about that. But I think it's an important question.
April?
I just have 2 quick questions for Phil and then a real question. 2 clarifications. So it's not
there's no, so there was discussion about whether they would do a sort of a morning show and stream it.
Yeah.
And that had zero response from the CBC, including just before the original station manager resigned, who had worked for the Spectator. There was a lot of pressure coming from people, and on CFMU, the campus radio station in Hamilton, at McMaster, he actually said, yeah, we should probably consider having some sort of online morning show. And then 2 weeks later, his resignation was announced. So yeah, they haven't done that.
So I was just curious, was this model tried in any other places, and do you know what happened? And I'm just wondering, I mean, CBC is talking about local and digital going forward, and is this a model that it looks
So
like
they were thinking of this as a model. That was a lot of the talk. And again, at the license renewals that were happening in 2000 and 2000, it ended up happening around 2012. They were, you know, they had everybody lined up. Everybody was lined up. Jennifer McGuire, all those people had lined up to talk about the Hamilton experiment as a way. It still hadn't launched, as a way to make, you know, local, regional programming available. They didn't say on the cheap, but you know, in a viable economic manner, sort of thing. The one model that they did do was when Kitchener-Waterloo was started at about the same time, they did find a little infill frequency, and they actually have a radio show that cuts into Metro Morning. So the Metro, you know, the regular CBL AM 99.1 feed here, it's pretty much goes through to Kitchener-Waterloo, as of course it does to Hamilton. But they cut out, and they have a local radio morning show in KW.
Is it streamed, or is it actually?
No, it's over the air. They've got a frequency. It's a little pocket frequency, right? So, but the response, because we didn't have time, but we actually did a follow-up research with them, and they were like, yeah, now we really have a CBC presence, even though it's only 2.5 hours a day. That is a real presence. It's the sound of people from Hamilton in KW, right? But, and so Hamilton could do that at any point, but I suppose when you've got 5 employees, it's not as easy to do.
And the web model wasn't tried anywhere else?
London, yes. They did, although London also is part of an infill morning show that is for the larger area. So they also do have a morning show. And they experimented with that well into the 90s. They started that experimentation in London.
Thank you. I saw.
I have a question for Matt. Matt, tell me if you think this is really crazy. So you were talking about the reason that Seattle journalists are more likely to interact with the audience on Twitter, right? Is because of the less job security. I would have thought, without looking at any data, so that's why it might be crazy, that they actually would have wanted to be more peer-facing in their tweet because of that same reason. So, like, you think you might be moving around, you may want to be sort of trying to impress each other, or you may want to, in more using terms, you may want to be like wiring capital in the field or something like that. So I'm just curious, like, how you came to that conclusion that it was because of the job insecurity that they were sort of more audience-facing instead of more peer-facing.
So, no, I don't think it's crazy.
Considered it
No.
reason why I wouldn't.
No, so I actually think the point is, maybe I didn't say it clearly enough, is that in both places they're trying to get peer recognition. How they get peer recognition depends, right? So, and I think, my guess is that in Seattle it's probably similar to what happens elsewhere in the US, which is like, if you're 25 years old, you just got out of university and you want to find a way to sort of move up the ranks, well, you don't do what you used to do, which is start at a local paper, have a beat and go on. One of the ways in which you try and move up the ranks very quickly is to show that you can bring in audiences, right? And so one of the ways you do that is by interacting, engaging, and of course there's this discourse about how you love it and you love the audiences and stuff like that. But I think that a big part of the reason, which is, well, I simultaneously think it's possible to be true and it can also have a social basis, right? And so I think that the way in which it happens in Seattle, and I would suspect in other places in the United States, I don't know about the Canadian case, is that people bring in audiences as a way to impress their managers and as a way to impress their peers, right? And so then you can begin to see these things happen. The part I didn't talk about in the French case is that the job market is very restricted and very tight. So it's very hard to get laid off. It's also very hard to get hired. And so you have very little incentive if you're on the sort of older end of the stick, because no one's going to fire you anyway. And if you're on the younger end of the stick, really, if you're trying to get a freelance contract, you really need a manager in a news organization to know about you, right? And so there the logic is, if I can show people that I know who everybody is and that other people have done this story and I'm going to do something slightly different, that's a way in which I can actually get hired, right? So it's like they're both seeking symbolic capital in Bourdieusian terms, but how they do it really depends on field dynamics.
Tigers.
Thanks for all these presentations. I really like how they went together. And so I want to ask the whole panel, actually, about this idea that we've been talking about, local news and social capital, because I think it comes up in everybody's presentation. Like there's the charitable giving and building social capital, but that originally came from a place of wanting to make more money. So this social capital is also at odds with this economic model. And you can see that playing out in Hamilton. I think we can see that on social media in between your two countries. And I even saw flickers of it in the Oshawa case study. So I'd love for you each to comment on your take on that.
Yeah, I think it'll be, in my case, it'll be, it's certainly not a zero-sum game. Like it's so intrinsically entwined, one in the other. And you have, for instance, with the Toronto Star, Joseph Atkinson and the Atkinson principles. So even though it's a private, not a public broadcaster kind of model, you still have these principles that are based on a social kind of contract with the community. But then I know that there are other situations that are different. We have, for instance, every year it's Toronto, the CBC food drive, this massive thing. So I think it's going to be interesting for me to pull that apart and figure out how much of it is and how it's put forward as maybe straight altruism versus I need social, especially now, I need some kind of social capital to prove my worthiness to continue existing. Yeah.
So it's a great question. So I would just say two things, well, maybe just one thing to keep it short. I think the question is really, what does social capital get you? And how does it get you something? And so I think actually in sort of strict Bourdieusian terms, it's really symbolic capital. So it's peer recognition rather than networks of friends and things like that. And I think the assumption, amongst managers in both places is that certain types of symbolic capital can bring economic capital, right? So literally the idea in the US case in Seattle is audiences bring money, right? But I actually don't think, at least that's not really true as far as I understand it, or as far as I've seen it in terms of how it actually plays out in Seattle. So I don't actually think that it converts as easily as might sometimes be assumed. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, because oftentimes a lot of the discussions we'll have will be about all the ways in which we can do things that are social, right, with the sort of background lurking assumption that it can be turned into something financial. And I think that that's a tenuous assumption to have, and oftentimes foregrounds the potential for market solutions as opposed to non-market solutions.
I guess in the Oshawa case, looking at it, it seems as though the closure of the paper came at a time when there was a lot of social and economic change in that particular community. The main industry there that had been there for an extended period of time was going through a period of downsizing that hasn't stopped in any sort of meaningful way. And I think if again had to hypothesize about what I saw with some of the the voter turnout stuff, it seems to me as though you probably have people having to sort of move and shift and sort of reform those sort of social ties and the community sort of changing. And I think that's maybe begun to happen now, but certainly during that period through the late 80s, the 90s and early 2000s, there was just a great amount of sort of disconnect, and it doesn't seem as though the presence or absence of that local daily newspaper, I mean, my assumption is that I don't know how much it played a part in adding to that in people's connections to their local community.
So the social capital question is an interesting one for a public broadcaster, right? Because essentially they're mandated to serve the public interest, which, you know, is almost as vague as the notion of social capital. But what happens is when you have moments of crisis, often around budget cuts to the CBC, one way to trace the social capital or the public interest is who comes out to defend the CBC, right? And so for TV, it tended to be, to a certain extent, on the national basis around subject areas. The only one that, you know, can really show national sports, especially hockey, okay? That was the case, supposedly with Rogers buying out Hockey Night in Canada. It isn't, although Rogers' experience with Hockey Night in Canada has been mixed. But in terms of the real, where the politicians lined up for the CBC, almost always happened on a local basis. And that was often around radio or preserving the supper hour news programs, which, you know, got degraded and built up and degraded, that whole sort of thing. So leading up to the license renewal for the CBC network for radio and TV, and in a way indirectly social media and online, there was an attempt again to cultivate the local audiences, and they really did do the work of doing a lot of promotional stuff about Hamilton. And people had bought into it. And then, oddly enough, after the license renewal, it kind of went away. Now, I'll try not to be too cynical about that, but, you know, there's a very mixed feeling. And part of it is a kind of, I hate to describe this about Hamilton, but they've been kicked around so often that anything they get often is considered good and they don't want to give it away. So it's, you know, I'm not sure, it doesn't apply exactly in the same way in terms of social capital, but in terms of trying to win the hearts of Hamiltonians, the strategy worked, but the long-term effect, I would argue, based on the audience engagement, has been very limited.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. I'm conscious that there's another panel starting at 5:15, so please, thank you for coming. Thanks to my fellow panelists for a really interesting discussion.